Hello, welcome to Context. I'm Orkhan Amashov. In what was described as the longest presidential speech to lawmakers on record, Donald Trump addressed a joint session of the US Congress for the first time since he returned to power in January, outlining his vision for the second term in a manner befitting his flamboyance and a whole range of idiosyncratic qualities defining the man in charge. In his high-octane, love it or hate it 100-minute address delivered subsequent to whirlwind 6 weeks in office, shaped by a flurry of executive orders and unprecedented foreign policy moves, the US president was buoyant and defiant, seemingly even enjoying being heckled by Democrats, who in turn were goaded by him. The speech was indeed big, not just in terms of its sheer duration, but also import, despite being largely somewhat predictable, albeit not entirely, of course, in its fundamental content, serving as a wrap-up of what the president has been saying all along the way for some considerable time. It's another question whether the address should be terminologically classified as a State of the Union speech or just a State of the Union style address to Congress. Technically, since a State of the Union address is typically given after the president has been in office for about a year, and bearing in mind that Trump's second term began only 6 weeks ago, formally it wasn't. With the Republicans in control of the White House and both houses of Congress, Democrats have been largely ineffective in countering the measures taken by the Trump administration. Well, Congressman Green was ejected out of the chamber due to the disruption caused, with his heckling being deemed as largely unhelpful. Whereas the rebuttal delivered by Democratic Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin of Michigan was solemn and traditional. Although Trump's critics believed that the speech delivered by him was relentlessly partisan, the man himself appears to be fully confident of being on the right side of history. In addition to saying America is back, he also added that under his presidency, the United States will forge the freest, most advanced, most dynamic and most dominant civilization ever to exist on the face of this earth. Self-aggrandizement of the highest order, many would say. And my guest today is Vlad Altiane, senior EU public affairs expert, joining from the capital of the European Union, Brussels, Belgium. Welcome, Vlad.
Good to be with you, Orkhan. Good to be with you.
Thank you very much indeed. Before asking about your key takeaways from Trump's speech, I would like to hear your view on whether you think it matters if the address should be classified as a State of the Union speech or just a presidential address to joint session of the US Congress. Does the distinction matter, actually?
No, it doesn't really matter. I think President Trump is going to deliver State of the Union speeches probably every week. Now, so not every year. On the other hand, it feels like he's president of the United States for much longer than just 6 weeks. So it doesn't really matter how we classify it. What really does matter is the content, and what really does matter is what the Democrat response to it has been.
Indeed, yeah. And about your key takeaways, what are your main takeaways from Trump's first address to Congress after his return to the White House?
I would think that there are four things which are very, very important. Some of them have to do with the way in which President Trump has delivered his speech. So this is the longest, and you're very right to say it, the longest speech in a long US presidential history of speeches. Those speeches included presidents discussing the Civil War in the United States. Those speeches included presidents discussing the First and the Second World War, the Vietnam War, the Korean War. Those speeches included the George W. Bush speech about the terrorist attacks on New York. So in all that, with all that in mind, having such a long speech without such a situation is rather exceptional. It shows to me that the United States is probably at the moment very well described by Alexis de Tocqueville in his brilliant book about democracy in America. Will the United States remain a republic, or will it turn to something else, i.e. monarchy? It sounded more like a monarchy. That is the first point. The second point, I think, I was not surprised by what was said during the speech. I think I was expecting most of it. There are, as usual, many elements which are, to be very frank, either not true or not entirely true. And then what I was a bit surprised of is basically the fact that the president has not secured a full cooperation of his own majority. So there are some Republican representatives who are clearly not at ease. And if you look at the images of the room while he was delivering the speech, not just Democrats were at unease with that. Some Republicans were as well. You mentioned one Democrat which had to be evacuated from the room, which is rather unusual for a US president's speech. Generally, congressmen do behave. In that case, I do not know to what extent it was a case of non-behavior or a case of simply not agreeing with what was told, the tone of it, and the quality, should I say. So it was quite a combination of things.
I see.
The last thing, which was, I think, very interesting for the European Union in particular, is that President Trump repeated, I don't know how many times, but clearly he repeated it again, that the United States is going to get Greenland one way or another, quote unquote, which is a very interesting way to put it. Now we know what we were sure about at the time, and that is basically that the Panama dispute was resolved with a lot of money. Does he mean that Greenland will be resolved by a lot of money as well? Or does he mean something else? And that is a very interesting question. Why? Because Greenland is part of Denmark, and Denmark is also the forthcoming presidency of the European Union as of 1st of July of this year.
Since our last conversation, which actually took place, I think the day before Prime Minister Keir Starmer's visit to the United States, a lot has happened. We had Zelensky-Trump spat, very historic and famous, perhaps infamous. And then, of course, there was a summit in the UK. And during that very address, Trump said that he had received an important letter from Ukraine's leader earlier in the day. And that particular letter seemed to match what President Zelensky earlier posted publicly on social media. What do you make of this particular moment? Do you think it's an apology? Because effectively what he said, Zelensky said that he is happy to work under the leadership of Donald Trump. Is it backtracking, or is it just a normal practice that he was compelled to use?
It is very, very likely that is a forceful behavior. So in other words, he was compelled to do this because of the very difficult situation of Ukraine, clearly, currently, militarily and economically. I think economically the dependency is higher on the European Union than on the United States. And I think President Macron was very right to correct the wrong data that President Trump suggested during their meeting in the Oval Office in terms of who is contributing what. And in the meantime, I think the Kiel Institute in Germany provided quite exact figures taken over by Financial Times, by The Economist, which were, I think, very, very clear. At the same time, on the military front, Ukraine has quite many dependencies on the United States. It is in a way, very simple, and in a way, very complex. Very simple because if you have weapons delivered, you need ammunition, which is standardized, which is compatible with those weapons. And for that, you do need the United States. That's one point. And the complex situation is that replacing that would mean replacing weapons and ammunition. For some parts of it, it is not possible. And for some parts of it, it is possible, but it will take time that Ukraine does not have. So I think President Zelensky was a bit forced, compiled into that. It is very worrisome to see what used to be considered as the biggest democracy in the world. I always said that is not true for a simple reason. In terms of citizens, probably India is the biggest democracy in the world. But what used to be the flag runner of democracies, of liberal democracies, compiling a country such as Ukraine into such a position. And it's not about President Zelensky, it's about the whole Ukraine. President Zelensky is just a representative, the highest representative. And if you look at the Oval Office, that seems very much to be a trapped situation, including the questions about why, sir, you do not wear a suit. or including the various times at which Vice President Vance was basically offending and in the offense throughout a long period of time. So it looked to me like a trap, and an excuse trap for President Trump to be able to actually probably ask for more.
And when it comes to Russia-Ukraine war and the developments taking place in Ukraine, is there a fundamental difference between the United States and the European countries about the perception of Russia as a threatening force? Americans seem to think that, yes, indeed, there is a big, nice ocean separating them from the continent and they're not immediately threatened. Is it partly to do with the fact that what Europeans call Russian threat is not palpably felt in the United States, with their focus being mostly centered around Chinese elements? Is that part of the thinking, you think?
It is very possible that that is the case. There is a very interesting graph that the economists put together on amounts of, so percentages of GDP defense spending within the European Union countries and their distance compared to Moscow. And you will see that nearer you go to Moscow, higher GDP goes, GDP spent, so the percentages. So it is, part of it is the geographical argument. And it is a nice and beautiful ocean on one side, but as we know, Russia is big. And on the other side, there is not such a nice and long ocean separating. Actually, there are touch points, even more.
Yes.
If we think about Alaska. So if we also think about what President Putin was saying during the conflict, and remember all the spats he had with President Biden via different declarations, President Putin was saying you are just, if I remember correctly, in the case of Europe, 10 to 15 minutes to a nuclear attack, and in the case of the United States, I think he mentioned half an hour. He's beating their physics because by the distance, the speed at which something like that should circulate would probably put the whole object in fire. But this being said, well, that nice ocean, it depends from where you launch what. So it may be nice, it may be looking good, but I don't think it is actually looking so good. So I think that position of President Trump is basically a very transactional position, to say we are going to get a peace, we are going to basically probably discuss resources, split resources, and it's a return to what used to be a big power game in the situation definitely prior to the Second World War.
And in the case of a possible change, possible conclusive change in US foreign policy regarding Russia, in case of those sanctions being lifted or somewhat relaxed, what will be the position of Russia on the international stage? Because there is a dichotomy when it comes to this Western understanding of what should be done with Russia. Britain and European Union countries seem to be very much determined to continue the policy of isolating Russia further. And this isolation of Russia seems to be part of the overall plan of supporting Ukraine. But United States of America has given some clear indications of changing this. They already suspended military aid to Ukraine, and they're already talking about easing some of the elements of punitive measures employed against Russia. How would this affect Russia's standing on the international stage vis-à-vis Ukraine and vis-à-vis continent?
I think it very much depends on which sanctions would be lifted by the United States or, if not lifted, changed in their scope or in their size. Of course, the European Union will have to react, and I think this is clearly part of the discussion that the leaders will have tomorrow. Because there is a European Council summit in Brussels tomorrow. Part of the discussion is how to react to that. How Europe will react is, of course, a function of how the United States will react, a function of how the UK does react. UK clearly now became a strategic defense partner of the European Union after the London meetings, and not just after the London meetings, even before, with the coordinated visits of President Macron and Prime Minister Starmer to Washington. So clearly on that side, there will be a discussion, a dialogue, and probably a common decision. But the European Union has not the capacity, I think, to completely ignore what the United States will do on the side of sanctions to Russia. If such sanctions will be lifted significantly, Russia's position on the international scene will probably change. It will become, again, a position of probable dialogue and importance for some of the actors. For some of the actors, that will not change because President Putin was able to actually meet a number of the leaders of the world despite the sanctions regime. And the sanctions regime was largely perceived as a Western or collective global North Western sanctions regime rather than a general accepted international community, including the global South, sanction regime against Russia. So President Putin, skip of the tongue there, was actually able to do a number of meetings on the international stage despite the sanctions. If the United States will lift sanctions or significantly diminish them, probably he will be able to do that more or easier, despite the fact that the European Union would maintain part of the sanctions. Probably the European Union would maintain part of the sanctions for longer than the United States would.
And also,
another thing which needs to be,
needs
to be remembered is that President Putin currently is under an international mandate of the International Court of Justice, and that will need to be somehow addressed. Not because the United States would do anything about it. The United States is not part of that and does not recognize that jurisdiction, but because some other countries in the world, and quite many of them, are part of the treaty and should, in theory at least, recognize that jurisdiction.
But
so something needs to be done.
That's about International Criminal Court, right? International Criminal Court.
Exactly, that is about the International Criminal Court.
Yes, indeed. And my next question, probably going to be my last question, but I won't say last from the beginning, one never knows, about the Greenland. You mentioned about it. President Trump said that one way or another we're going to get it. I wonder what it entails, whether it entails similar arrangement regarding the canal or not. But he mentioned about the international and national importance of the Greenland. He said that it's a question of national security, and then added that it's also a question of international security. Why Greenland is so important?
I think there are a number of elements to that. Probably he's thinking more of the resources that Greenland has. Of course, he's thinking also of the geographical position of Greenland. He's thinking about the position of Greenland within the Arctic region. So probably there are a number of elements which would make President Trump reach that conclusion that Greenland needs to be with the United States. I still fail to see how Greenland being part of the US would improve the international security or actually the regional security. I think working with Denmark, Greenland is in a quite good position. Nobody disputed the current Danish relationship with Greenland and the current Denmark contribution to the international order in a very positive way. So it is very difficult to understand how come a US allocation, if we could call it that way, would improve the situation. It is very clear that a US allocation would clearly create problems for the international order because while the status quo is acceptable, a full US allocation or a full Greenland allocation to US would probably create other types of problems for other powers in the world who may not really accept that. And to think about the Panama situation and the Panama deal, doing a concession over a channel or doing any commercial type of concession is one thing. Getting Panama all together would have been a completely different thing. So the same thing for Greenland. Would it be an agreement on resource exploration? Which is possible. Militarily, the US has already presence in Greenland with the acceptance of Denmark. And by the way, Denmark is one of the EU member states which was always following the US policy and always very friendly to the various US presidents. And by that, I understand to the various US presidents since pretty much since President Eisenhower till today. So it's a very long-standing relationship, friendship, and of cooperation there. And it will be very disruptive, I think, to send the wrong message to your friends. President Trump did that with Canada, did that with Mexico, does that with the European Union. And I think the friends are there to help you in good and bad times, but nobody should abuse their benevolence.
Well, in particular, bearing in mind that President Trump is habitually referring to Canadian Prime Minister as governor, which is also disrespectful, probably. In particular, bearing in mind the head of state of Canada is actually His Majesty the King, and bearing in mind Trump's liking towards the monarchy in Britain, I think that there's an element of abuse there too, which probably he is not particularly aware of. Well, thank you very much indeed, Vlad. Thank you very much indeed for this conversation. This was Vlad Altiană, Senior EU Public Affairs Expert, who joined from Brussels, Belgium. See you very soon indeed.